Every map of Asia shows you the land masses, the mountains, the rivers, the borders politicians drew and armies defended. But maps hide the single geographic feature controlling more wealth than any continent, a 550-mile corridor of water, 2 miles wide at its narrowest point connecting two oceans, the Strait of Malacca. China built the largest navy in human history. India modernized its fleet. Japan maintains one of the most sophisticated maritime forces on Earth, 3 nuclear powers, combined military budgets exceeding $400 billion annually, and all 3 remain hostage to a passage of water smaller than the state of Vermont. Geography did not give Asia its economic destiny. This strait did. Control the Malacca Strait, and you control the flow of goods between 4 billion people. Lose access to it, and your economy suffocates within weeks. This is the choke point hiding in plain sight, the pressure point where empires rise, fall, and modern superpowers remain vulnerable. For 1,500 years, the pattern repeats without variation. Whoever dominates these waters dominates Asian commerce. Whoever loses access watches their economy collapse. The names change, the dynasties rotate, the technology evolves, but the geographic constant remains unchanged since Buddhist monks first documented its importance in the 7th century. The distinction matters. Oil made the Middle East wealthy. The Malacca Strait made Southeast Asia the gatekeeper of global trade. One produces a commodity. The other controls the bottleneck through which all commodities must pass. Production creates profits. Gatekeeping creates leverage. And leverage, applied across centuries, creates the infrastructure of permanent extraction. Welcome to Rashi Historical. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. The phone in your pocket passed through this strait. The gas in your car passed through this strait. The components of your refrigerator, your television, your laptop, your children's toys, all of it funneled through 550 miles of water between Malaysia and Indonesia. 80,000 vessels per year, 1/4 of all global trade, 40% of the world's liquefied natural gas, 30% of the world's crude oil shipments. You experience this strait every time you purchase anything manufactured in Asia or powered by Middle Eastern petroleum. Your cost of living rises or falls based on shipping rates through these waters. Your job security connects to supply chains dependent on this passage remaining open. The Malacca Strait is not ancient history. It is the invisible tax on your daily existence and the structural vulnerability of the global economy you inhabit. In 671 CE, a Chinese Buddhist monk named Yi Jing boarded a Persian merchant vessel in Guangzhou. His mission was religious: travel to India, study Sanskrit texts, bring Buddhist teachings back to China. His documentation became the first detailed economic analysis of the Malacca Strait's commercial machinery. Yi Jing spent 6 months in the kingdom of Srivijaya, centered on the island of Sumatra. What he recorded in his record of Buddhist practices sent home from the southern sea went beyond spiritual observations. He documented a maritime empire built entirely on controlling the narrow waters between two oceans. Srivijaya possessed no significant agricultural base. The kingdom produced minimal exportable goods. Its territory consisted of coastal settlements and island chains without the population density of mainland Asian empires. By every conventional measure of imperial power, Srivijaya should have remained a regional footnote. Instead, it dominated Southeast Asian commerce for 600 years. The Srivijayan system operated on a principle modern economists would recognize. The kingdom did not need to produce wealth. It needed to position itself at the bottleneck where wealth must pass. Every merchant vessel traveling between Tang Dynasty China and the kingdoms of India, between Arabian traders and Southeast Asian spice producers, between Persian Gulf merchants and Pacific markets, had one realistic route: through the Malacca Strait. And Srivijaya controlled both sides of the passage. Tang Dynasty court records preserved in the Old Book of Tang document the relationship with precision. Srivijayan ambassadors arrived in the Chinese capital bearing tribute. Chinese merchants departed with licenses to trade in Srivijayan waters. The arrangement appeared diplomatic. It functioned as a toll system. Access to the strait required Srivijayan permission. Permission required payment. The tributary records detail the goods flowing through Srivijayan ports: camphor from Borneo, sandalwood from Timor, cloves and nutmeg from the Maluku Islands, pepper from Sumatra and Java, silk and porcelain from China, cotton textiles and gemstones from India, frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, gold from every direction. Srivijaya did not grow these products. Srivijayan merchants did not transport the majority of cargo. The kingdom extracted wealth by providing 3 services: safe passage through waters otherwise plagued by piracy, monsoon timing knowledge allowing merchants to wait for favorable winds, and a neutral trading port where buyers and sellers from hostile civilizations conducted business without conflict. The infrastructure of extraction functioned through the port of Palembang. Merchants arriving from China during the northeast monsoon season anchored in Srivijayan harbors. They waited months for winds to shift, allowing westward passage to India. During the waiting period, they paid harbor fees. They purchased supplies. They traded cargo with merchants arriving from the opposite direction. The strait's geography created a forced waiting period. Srivijaya monetized the waiting. Yijing documented over 1,000 Buddhist monks studying in Srivijayan monasteries, merchants from China, India, Persia, and Arabia walking the same port streets, multiple languages spoken in markets, different religions practiced without persecution. The kingdom maintained this cosmopolitan environment for commercial purposes. Traders who felt safe returned. Traders who returned paid tolls repeatedly. The Srivijayan model contained a structural vulnerability later empires would exploit. The kingdom's wealth depended entirely on maritime traffic continuing through its waters. Any power capable of diverting trade or seizing the strait's choke points would inherit the entire extraction system. Srivijaya invested in diplomacy, religious soft power, and limited naval patrols. It did not invest in the military infrastructure to resist a determined invader with superior technology. For 6 centuries, no such invader appeared. Then the Portuguese arrived. Afonso de Albuquerque understood choke point strategy before the term existed. The Portuguese naval commander wrote to King Manuel I in 1510 with a proposal to strangle Islamic commerce at its source. His letters, preserved in the Torre do Tombo National Archive in Lisbon, outline a systematic plan to seize control of 3 maritime bottlenecks: the Strait of Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait controlling access to the Red Sea, and the Malacca Strait commanding passage between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Control these 3 points, Albuquerque argued, and Portugal would hold the throat of Asian trade. The strategy required no massive territorial conquest, no administration of millions of subjects, no expensive colonial infrastructure. Seize the gates, tax everyone passing through. The same model Srivijaya had operated for 600 years, applied with European gunpowder technology. Albuquerque captured Goa in 1510. 1 year later, he sailed from Malacca with 200 men and 18 ships. His commentaries document the strategic calculation driving the expedition. Malacca is the richest seaport with the greatest number of wholesale merchants and abundance of shipping that can be found in the whole world. Cairo and Mecca will be entirely ruined, and Venice will receive no spiceries unless her merchants go and buy them in Portugal. The commercial intelligence proved accurate. Portuguese forces captured Malacca in August 1511 after a month of fighting. The cargo inventories seized from warehouses documented the strait's throughput, spices valued at fortunes, Chinese silk and porcelain, Indian textiles, Arabian horses, precious stones, gold and silver in quantities astonishing the Portuguese crown. The conquest of Malacca demonstrated a principle later empires would apply. Maritime choke points function as force multipliers. A relatively small military investment yields control over trade, flows far exceeding the attacker's natural economic weight. Portugal, a kingdom of 1 million people, positioned itself to tax commerce between civilizations totaling hundreds of millions. The Portuguese maintained control of Malacca for 130 years. During this period, they established the administrative framework later colonial powers would inherit and expand. Fixed tariff schedules for goods passing through the strait, licensed trading permits for Asian merchants, fortified positions at the narrowest channels, naval patrols targeting unlicensed vessels. Portuguese Malacca also demonstrated the limits of choke point control. Enforcement required constant naval presence. Rival powers, including the Sultanate of Johor and the Achinese Sultanate, launched repeated attacks. Chinese merchants shifted portions of their trade to alternative routes through the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra. The Portuguese extracted enormous wealth from the Malacca position, but maintaining the position consumed significant military resources. The Dutch seized Malacca in 1641, applying superior naval power and alliances with regional sultanates. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, operated the strait as a corporate asset rather than a royal possession. VOC records document the systematic commercialization of the choke point. Fixed fee schedules, insurance arrangements, standardized weights and measures. The Dutch transformed Portuguese extraction into Dutch extraction with better accounting. For the next 180 years, the Dutch dominated the Malacca Strait. Their control proved less total than Portuguese ambitions had envisioned. Regional sultanates maintained independent trading networks. Chinese junks continued sailing routes beyond Dutch patrol capacity. The strait generated profits, but never the complete commercial monopoly European powers imagined. Then the British recognized an opportunity the Dutch had overlooked. Stamford Raffles arrived in Southeast Asia in 1805 as an assistant secretary to the British colonial government in Penang. He spent the next 14 years studying the region's commerce, politics, and geography with an intensity bordering on obsession. His correspondence with the Governor-General of India, Lord Hastings, preserved in the British Library, reveals a mind focused on a single strategic objective. The Dutch controlled Malacca and the northern strait, but the southern entrance to the strait remained under the fractured authority of local sultanates. Whoever controlled the southern gate would position themselves at the entry point for ships arriving from India, Arabia, and Europe. The Dutch had built their position at the wrong end of the choke point. Raffles identified a small island at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, Singapore, a fishing village of perhaps 1,000 inhabitants, minimal agricultural potential, no significant natural resources, no existing trade infrastructure. By every conventional measure, a worthless acquisition. Raffles understood what conventional measures missed. Singapore sat at the intersection of the Malacca Strait and the Singapore Strait, the final passage before ships entered the open South China Sea. Control Singapore, and you control the last gate between two oceans. On February 6, 1819, Raffles concluded a treaty with a local Malay ruler. The British gained rights to establish a trading settlement on Singapore. Raffles declared the port a free trade zone, no tariffs on imports or exports. Any merchant from any nation could conduct business without restriction. The strategy appeared to contradict the Portuguese and Dutch model. Why control a choke point if you refuse to extract tolls? British East India Company records from 1820 to 1850 document the calculation. Free trade attracted merchants. Dutch Malacca charged fees. Portuguese trading posts imposed tariffs. Regional sultanates demanded payments. Singapore charged nothing. Within 3 years, merchants from China, India, Arabia, and Europe redirected their shipping to the British port. Trade volume at Singapore exceeded Malacca by 1823. By 1830, Singapore had become the dominant entrepot in Southeast Asia. The British extraction operated at a different layer. They did not tax goods, they taxed services, harbor fees for ships anchoring in Singapore waters, warehouse rentals for merchants storing cargo, insurance premiums for vessels and goods, financial services for traders conducting transactions. The British monetized the infrastructure around the choke point rather than the choke point itself. The model proved more sustainable than direct tolls. Merchants paying tariffs resent the payment and seek alternatives. Merchants paying for services perceive value received. The British made themselves indispensable rather than unavoidable. Ships could sail through the Sunda Strait and avoid Malacca. But Singapore offered services unavailable elsewhere: banking, insurance, warehousing, legal frameworks for contract enforcement. The British built a commercial ecosystem rather than a toll booth. Company shipping records document Singapore's growth trajectory. 31 ships arrived in 1819. By 1824, over 3,000 vessels called at the port annually. Trade value increased from nothing to millions of Spanish dollars within 5 years. By 1850, Singapore processed more commerce than any other Southeast Asian port. The British model contained an innovation later city-states would replicate. Singapore did not need territory, natural resources, or large populations. It needed strategic position, superior services, and stable governance. The island transformed from fishing village to global trading hub within a single generation by monetizing geography rather than extracting from it. This model would survive decolonization, Japanese occupation, merger with Malaysia, and independence. The structural position remained constant across every political transformation. Singapore gained independence in 1965 under circumstances its founders considered disastrous. Expelled from the Malaysian Federation, no natural resources, no agricultural hinterland, no strategic depth. A city of 2 million people on an island smaller than New York City. Lee Kuan Yew, the first prime minister, assessed the situation with characteristic directness. Singapore would survive by doing what it had done since 1819, monetizing its position at the southern gate of the Malacca Strait. The Singapore Maritime and Port Authority documents the scale of what this position now commands. 130,000 vessels pass through Singapore annually. The port handles 37.5 million TEUs per year, making it the second busiest container port on Earth. 20% of the world's shipping containers pass through this city-state. Singapore refines more petroleum than it could ever consume, processing 1.5 million barrels daily for vessels passing through the strait. The numbers translate to leverage. Singapore controls the final bottleneck between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Ships carrying Middle Eastern oil to China, Japan, and South Korea pass through Singaporean waters. Ships carrying Chinese manufactured goods to Europe pass through Singaporean waters. Ships carrying Indonesian and Malaysian commodities to global markets pass through Singaporean waters. Singapore monetizes this position through the same model Raffles established 2 centuries ago: services rather than tolls. The port operates 24 hours daily, 365 days per year. Ships receive refueling, repairs, resupply, and crew changes. Cargo transfers between vessels. Financial transactions clear through Singaporean banks. Insurance contracts execute under Singaporean law. Legal disputes resolve in Singaporean courts. The infrastructure of maritime commerce operates from this 280 square mile island. The model generates 20% of Singapore's GDP directly from port operations. Financial services, built on maritime commerce, generate another 15%. The city-state maintains one of the highest per capita incomes on Earth. No natural resources, no agricultural production, no manufacturing base comparable to neighboring countries. Strategic position transformed into permanent prosperity. Singapore's success illuminates the structural reality governing Asian economics. The strait remains the single most consistent factor determining regional wealth distribution. Srivijaya controlled it for 600 years and dominated Southeast Asian commerce. Portugal seized it and redirected global spice trade. Britain positioned itself at its southern gate and built a commercial empire. Singapore inherited the position and became a first world economy within 3 decades of independence. The pattern holds without exception across 1,500 years of documented history. Control the Malacca Strait, control Asian commerce, which brings us to the power currently most threatened by this geographic constant. In 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao delivered an internal speech to Communist Party leadership. The contents leaked to academic journals and have since been confirmed by Chinese strategic publications. Hu named China's greatest vulnerability, the Malacca dilemma. China imports 70% of its oil. The majority of these imports travel by tanker from the Middle East and Africa. The tankers pass through the Malacca Strait. China imports raw materials from Africa, South America, and the Middle East. The bulk carriers pass through the Malacca Strait. China exports manufactured goods to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The container ships pass through the Malacca Strait. 80% of China's oil imports transit through this single choke point. The percentage for total seaborne trade exceeds 60%. The world's second largest economy depends on 550 miles of water it does not control. The United States Navy maintains permanent presence in the region. Singapore hosts American naval vessels. The Philippines maintains defense agreements with Washington. Japan, South Korea, and Australia coordinate with American forces. India patrols the strait's western approaches. China confronts a maritime environment where potential adversaries control every position of leverage. Chinese strategic planners published their analysis in journals including Contemporary International Relations and Pacific Journal. The conclusions repeated across multiple studies. Any conflict with the United States would result in immediate blockade of the Malacca Strait. Chinese oil imports would cease within days. Industrial production would halt within weeks. The Chinese economy would collapse within months. The geography creates an inescapable constraint. China built the largest navy in history by ship count. It possesses advanced missiles capable of striking vessels throughout the South China Sea. Its submarines patrol increasingly distant waters. None of this solves the fundamental problem. The Malacca Strait lies 2,000 miles from Chinese shores. Between China and the strait sits a ring of American allies and strategic partners. Military superiority in the South China Sea provides no guarantee of access to the Indian Ocean. The Malacca dilemma explains Chinese behavior. Western analysts often interpret as irrational. Why does China invest billions in a port in Pakistan called Gwadar? The port loses money. Pakistan lacks the infrastructure to support major shipping operations. The project makes no commercial sense. It makes perfect strategic sense. Gwadar sits on the Arabian Sea, bypassing the Malacca Strait entirely. Oil and goods arriving at Gwadar travel overland through Pakistan to China via roads, railways, and pipelines Beijing finances through the Belt and Road Initiative. The route is longer and more expensive than sea transport through Malacca. It is also immune to naval blockade. Why does China invest in a port in Myanmar called Chokepoint? Myanmar's government is unstable. The port region faces ethnic conflicts. Infrastructure in the country remains primitive. Commercial calculations argue against the investment. Strategic calculations demand it. Chokepoint sits on the Bay of Bengal. Oil and goods arriving there bypass Malacca through pipelines and transport corridors running directly into southwestern China. Another escape route from the Malacca dilemma. Why does China finance railways across Malaysia and Thailand? The East Coast Rail Link and various proposed canal projects make limited commercial sense given existing shipping efficiency. They provide alternatives to the Malacca Strait, land routes immune to naval interdiction. China is spending over $1 trillion on Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. A significant portion of this spending represents one objective: solving a geographic problem Srivijaya, Portugal, Britain, and Singapore each exploited for centuries. The documented pattern repeats. Every major Asian maritime power confronts the Malacca Strait as either an opportunity or a vulnerability. Srivijaya built an empire by controlling it. China faces potential strangulation from its inability to guarantee access. The investment scale reveals the strategic valuation. China assigns trillion-dollar importance to circumventing a 550-mile waterway. This pricing reflects 1,500 years of historical evidence. The strait determines economic destinies. Powers controlling it thrive. Powers dependent on it remain vulnerable. The calculus holds from 7th century Buddhist pilgrims to 21st century container ships. The permanent choke point. The Malacca Strait will remain the defining geographic feature of Asian economics for the foreseeable future. No alternative route matches its efficiency. The Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra adds distance and navigational challenges. The Lombok Strait east of Bali adds further distance. Arctic routes remain seasonal and underdeveloped. Land routes across Central Asia lack the capacity to replace maritime shipping. Geography is permanent. The strait will continue funneling 1/4 of global trade through its narrow passage. The names of dominant powers will change. The fundamental structure will not. Singapore will maintain its position at the southern gate for as long as maritime commerce requires services, legal frameworks, and financial infrastructure. The city-state faces no geographic competitor for its role. China will continue investing in alternative routes for as long as the Malacca dilemma threatens its economic security. The investment will total trillions before completion. The alternatives will never fully replace strait access. The United States will continue maintaining naval presence in the region for as long as Chokepoint control provides leverage over Chinese economic activity. American strategic planners read the same with 1,500-year history Chinese analysts study. You exist within this system whether you recognize it or not. The prices you pay for manufactured goods include shipping costs through the Malacca Strait. The stability of oil markets depends on tanker traffic through the Malacca Strait. The security of your retirement investments connects to supply chains passing through the Malacca Strait. The employment in your community ties to trade flows transiting the Malacca Strait. This is the $100 trillion choke point, the passage where 1/4 of global commerce concentrates into a 2-mile wide channel. The geographic constant governing Asian economic destiny since the Tang dynasty. The vulnerability keeping Chinese strategic planners awake at night and driving trillion-dollar infrastructure investments. The official histories teach you about emperors, battles, and treaties. They rarely mention the 550 miles of water, determining which emperors grew wealthy, which battles mattered, and which treaties held commercial value. The Malacca Strait does not appear in most textbooks. It appears in shipping manifests, strategic assessments, and the investment portfolios of nations building their futures around a passage of water older than any existing government. Srivijaya understood, Portugal understood, Britain understood, Singapore understands, China understands. Now you understand. The strait remains. The leverage remains. The choke point, collecting its toll on global commerce for 15 centuries, continues collecting. And every power seeking to dominate Asian trade confronts the same geographic constant their predecessors faced. Some gates never close, some tolls never cease. Some choke points remain eternal. The Malacca Strait is all three.